Today, I'll be speaking with Ohio State Representative Fred Strayhorn about Democratic politics and how the party plans to turn votes into populist policy. Also, I'll have an exclusive sit-down interview with State Senator Peggy Lehner about education in Ohio. Finally, I'll have a few thoughts on the second inauguration of our 44th President, Barack Obama. February is Black History Month. Welcome to Realpolitik. Hello, and welcome to Realpolitik. I'm Marcus Bedinger. I want to start by thanking you for tuning in to our premiere episode. Here at Realpolitik, we hope to deliver a program that is informative, intriguing, intelligent, and compelling. We'll talk politics and policy with elected officials and dig deeper into the issues that matter to you the most. With that in mind, let's run through today's lineup. I'll be talking education, employment, healthcare, and taxes. That's the Ohio Democratic Party's plan, and Ohio State Representative Fred Strayhorn is here with me to discuss how the party plans to message that effectively. Then I sit down with Ohio State Representative Roland Wimburn to hear how he plans to focus his next term on agricultural policy, workforce development, and tax credits. And in an exclusive interview, I will talk to Ohio State Senator Peggy Lehner about school vouchers, Governor Kasich's school funding blueprint, and her plans for Ohio schools. But first, the inauguration. On January 21st, Barack Obama took the presidential oath, marking the start to his second term in office. Despite Beyonce Gate, the inaugural ceremonies were exciting. The weather was nicer than the first time he took the oath, the country was on First Lady fashion watch, and the music, including Beyonce, was thrilling. But what stood out the most to me and what should have grabbed headlines was President Obama's inaugural address. Some have even argued that the shadow of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech and President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation made President Obama's speech even more poignant. In both addresses, President Obama sang a specific tune, "We the People." However, it was the second address where he really emphasized that point. He used his gift of oratory to nudge Americans into coalescing around a progressive agenda. By nestling his vision for the future between common expressions of Americanism, he singled out his ideas as the only way forward if we are to live up to the promise of our founding documents. The election in 2012, when the president won a decisive victory over Republican challenger Mitt Romney, proved that many Americans already support President Obama's goals. But there are still many people who do not. His speech seemed to acknowledge that divide and address the people standing on both ends of it. If the president's policies were the 21st Century Express, the inaugural address was a pick-me-up for the conductors who control the locomotive and a boarding pass for anyone who has yet to take a ride. The speech also fit a theme that Team Obama has developed over the years: make the president everything to everybody. The harder he is to pin down, the easier it is to be flexible when the time comes. That contrived effort to make Obama's administration as malleable as possible is what leaves so much room for interpretation when he sets forth his priorities. The second inaugural further extended this theme, even if it failed to do anything else. You need not look any further than Republicans' collective shriek of terror to know that they consider President Obama's speech partisan drivel. What really scares them is the notion that President Obama has been holding back, but is now ready to act as tough as he talks. In fact, the Republican leader in the House of Representatives has since claimed to have uncovered President Obama's nefarious plot to destroy the GOP. That may seem a bit dramatic, but the House leader's sentiment is shared by many in his party. They have always harbored a deep sense of distrust for the president. And now that he has delivered yet another electoral thumping to their party and is free from ever having to be a candidate again, the distrust has only grown. Compare the Republicans' reaction to the inaugural address with those who consider themselves to be in the middle. Many of them heard the same President Obama that they voted for in 2008 and watched in action for the last 4 years. Perhaps his words were a bit more pointed. Maybe he touched on an issue that he hadn't before, but nothing major was seriously changed. Finally, the progressive end of the political spectrum saw a president who was coming into his own. No longer were they digging through political nuance or wonky policy details to find tiny glimmers of progressive thinking. During that speech, President Obama took issue after issue and sounded the Democratic battle cry with fervor. Regardless of how anyone perceived the speech, it was a big moment for President Obama. Honestly, inaugurations are destined to be big. However, the president decided to go even bigger by making the speech a reflection of what he truly believes. Over the last 4 years, there were tiny indications that the electorate wanted to move in his direction. The president's speech not only made that okay, but it essentially labeled that path forward as the mainstream. And for a president who is more accustomed to giving speeches that outline where he thinks he can take the nation on policy, or that reveal his hopes for a specific issue, this rare moment of personal conviction was refreshing. Those 19 minutes were the closest Americans will ever get to reading a personal Barack Obama journal entry. He believed wholeheartedly in what he said, and delivering those words to an antsy nation was clearly a cathartic moment for him. Summed up, the speech said one thing: the second term would not be like the first. He no longer was under any illusions about working with Republicans. He made no apologies for gathering his coalition of the ascendant and turning them into an electoral army. He wouldn't be wasting time seeking principled compromise with those who are wholly uninterested in compromising. He seemed to warn Republicans that they had missed their chance to play a major role in what takes place. From here on out, it would be the Obama show, and the Republicans would be the guys who couldn't find the remote but were too lazy to get off the couch and change the channel. This is a tack President Obama couldn't take before. The litany of problems left behind by the previous administration required immediate action. And the Republican Party's obstruction, a tactic they devised the very day of the first inauguration, begged vigilance from the Obama White House. They had to ensure that they could move on policy without looking like they were sidelining a group of people who had already sidelined themselves. If you think back to 2009, you'll recall that the economy was on the brink of disaster. America was fighting 2 wars, and the global unrest that we see today was only getting started. On top of those challenges, he had to deal with the ever-divided Congress. There were those in the country who hoped for a meaningful action on a range of issues: taxes and spending, health care, climate change, LGBT rights, equal work, equal pay, Guantanamo Bay. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. Now, in 2012, we can still list many of those same issues as pressing matters. Climate change has not been dealt with in any large way. Comprehensive immigration reform has eluded both Congress and the president. Healthcare was passed, but in such an ugly way that the bill is still unpopular 3 years later. We continue hammering away at the tax issues. Spending cuts have come at a costly price to the economy and President Obama. States have moved more swiftly than federal government on the same-sex marriages, the failed drug war, and recently even gun violence. So when you come back to the president's last inaugural speech, the progressive tone it carried was not the only surprising aspect. What stood out further yet was President Obama's response to all of those issues. Where there was once a genuine desire to reach bipartisan consensus, there was now a partisan resolve to address them in the way he sees fit. He made clear that it is all of us together who will face the consequences of a failure to act, and that if the Republican Party was not willing to offer constructive input, then he would act alone. But truthfully, he wouldn't be acting alone. He would have the American people by his side. With that support, he would be willing to press Congress to do what Americans agree with him on, instead of letting Republicans fight for policies that the electorate already rejected. On climate change, President Obama insisted that it is more important to act now than waiting for Republicans to accept science. His ominous warning about ceding renewable energy technology to other countries added a touch of nationalism to the debate. In other words, we can't be a leader, the indispensable nation, if we let other countries leapfrog us in creating the industries of tomorrow. When it comes to immigration, the president insisted that we bring 11 million people out of the shadows and create a pathway for them to legally participate in the nation they call home. And he spoke to the aspirations of dreamers who do not fully belong to the only country they have ever known. And he also made honorable mention of the many highly skilled individuals that we send back to their country of birth after educating them in our schools. That's a job issue, the president said. For the first time in the history of the United States, a sitting president demanded that we treat our LGBT community with common respect. He spoke many times about being created equal, laying at the nation's feet a challenge to make that real in our actions toward one another. President Obama also touched on entitlements and deficits. In doing so, he offered a full-throated defense of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Those programs don't hinder personal responsibility or sap initiative. On the contrary, they remove roadblocks that may keep people from pursuing their full human potential. Sticking to a theme from his presidential campaign, he emphasized a balanced approach to reducing the deficit. The tragedy in Newtown provided an opportunity to speak on keeping our children safe from gun violence. That followed his wide-ranging set of proposals for addressing assault weapons, background checks, high-capacity magazines, and the like. There is no guarantee that all of his proposals will become law, but he promised to put the full weight of his office behind passing them. Elections reform was a topic that struck to the heart of anyone who voted in the last election. 7-hour waits in voting lines, efforts at disenfranchisement, and the hodgepodge of statewide election laws have no place in the greatest voting democracy in history. On this, he mirrored the comments he made in his victory speech. At the time, those words were a small aside. Now, elections reform was a priority worthy of mention at the inauguration. President Obama addressed each topic in a new, largely progressive way. He seemed unencumbered by the ruse of bipartisanship in today's politics. He seemed relieved knowing that he was never having to run another electoral campaign. And he seemed buoyed by the very real support he enjoys from Americans. And add to that the lack of support Republicans have anymore. President Obama's second and last inaugural address was the preface to what will most likely be the most forceful State of the Union address he gives. He is, after all, establishing the groundwork for his last few years as President of the United States. Something tells me he wants to be remembered more for forceful actions that people may disagree with than for twiddling his thumbs, waiting on the Republican Party's come to Jesus moment. We'll be right back after the message.
Hey yo, it's like
Welcome back to Realpolitik. I'm here with Ohio Representative Fred Strayhorn. Thank you for joining us, Representative.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with your election. How does it feel to be back in the House of Representatives sooner than you expected?
It feels good. I've always had a great affinity for this job and this work. I love the institution, the General Assembly. I think part and parcel does great work. I had intended to run in 2014 again anyway, so it feels good to be back, and I'm just looking forward to serving this community and the state as best I can.
Okay. And talk a little bit about how the district changed from the district you represented before to your current district.
Previously, the city of Dayton was part of two separate state rep districts, and now with the last redistricting, it's pretty much been consolidated for the most part as one district along with Jefferson Township.
It's a budget year. There are some important decisions coming up. Are you excited about the opportunities to maybe put your fingerprint on maybe some of the things going on in terms of spending policy?
Yeah, I don't sit on Finance and Appropriations Committee, but you know, the budget is arguably the most important thing we do. It's certainly the biggest and where most of the spending happens. I am in the minority party, as I have been my entire legislative career, But there are opportunities to reach across the aisle and try to work with Republican members to improve certain ideas or add our 2 cents to see if we can't do the best job we can on the budget and allocating those resources for everyone in the state of Ohio.
Okay, and with Ohio's General Assembly, does it mirror our federal Congress where the partisan battles are so fever pitched that they overshadow what needs to be done on policy, or is there a real sense that, you know, bipartisanship should prevail?
That's a good question. I've never worked in Congress, so I'm not totally sure how to answer the question. You know, in both cases, ideology is an issue. It's a significant issue. I think one of the things that's different about the Ohio General Assembly currently is that the Republican Party controls every phase of government, both chambers, the House and the Senate, and the governor's office. Government is split on the federal level, and so when government is split like that, it does afford more opportunities to do give and take and try to find compromise. I haven't seen a ton of that in Washington lately, but there are opportunities to do that. Like I said, I've served in the General Assembly for a number of years previously. You know, I've tried to build up a reputation of being concerned about the issues, not hyper-partisan, and being able to work with Republican members and reach across the aisle to do that, and I'll continue to do that this term.
Let's talk a little bit about making decisions. And recently, Governor Kasich made a decision to forego Ohio setting up its own health insurance exchange. What do you make of that decision from the governor's office?
Yeah, I was a little surprised, but not totally. I was surprised because conservatives, particularly in Ohio, talk a lot about returning authority and decision making and having that rest with the states. So I would have thought that they would have wanted to be in more control of what that looked like than not. I'm not surprised because most conservatives that I've watched have not really been very favorable about the healthcare reform and may have just not wanted to take any ownership whatsoever. I'm hopeful that it will not be sabotaged though, and that we will be able to have some input as well with the federal government so that we do a better job of making sure it's catered to the specific needs of Ohioans.
So let's talk a little bit about those needs. What health issues do we face here in the state, maybe specific to the district, that will be addressed by the insurance exchanges?
I think the health needs are fairly consistent across the board. I think access becomes the bigger issue is, are enough people having access to preventative care, the screenings? Are we essentially involved in more of a prospective healthcare model, meaning preventative care? The previous model had way too many incidents of we wouldn't fund the thing that was less money and more proactive to keep somebody from getting sick, but we would fund the thing that once the condition became very acute and cost a lot of money, then we would pay for that. So we wouldn't pay for the screening for diabetes, but if your health declined and you needed hemodialysis or amputation, then we would fund that. So you're both in a worse health outcome, and it's also incredibly more expensive. And so I think the healthcare reform is aimed at trying to get to more of that model where we're doing some things up front to, one, keep you in better health, but also it's more cost effective over the long run.
And you've mentioned before your priorities, employment, education, healthcare, and taxes. We've talked about healthcare. What would you like to see on taxes at the state level?
Well, I think what's important about taxation is to make sure that it's a progressive system, that it's appropriate for what that person is making and the resources that they have, that they're not overburdened. The notion that a person who makes $40,000 would pay the same as a person who makes $1 million just doesn't make sense, because they may be paying a much greater share of what they have than that millionaire who might be paying the same rate. And so the progressive tax system is designed at sort of making a balance between that, but also making sure that people who can afford to invest in the country are still doing that, because it's those opportunities that make the country strong and opportunities available for everybody, for the broader population. And so a progressive tax structure that is adequate to fund the things that we need to do. The fact that we're not investing in infrastructure the same way, that will both put people back to work, but also allow those workers to be stronger consumers and buy products and fuel production, equates to prosperity for wealthy people and corporations as well. So it's a balance.
And not to mention that, storms and these natural disasters have been tearing our infrastructure to pieces across the country, not just here in Ohio.
Yeah, I mean,
we actually have some areas that are receiving
Yep.
federal assistance just for that specific reason, right?
yeah, I mean, people have to understand that one of the roles of government is to make sure that it does the things that you can't do, but also the framework for opportunity to occur. We won't do everything for you, but that framework needs to be there. It's hard to have personal responsibility if there are 10 applicants for every job. So the framework has to be there for opportunity to exist and people to take advantage of that.
On a specific tax, Governor Kasich has some plans for the severance tax for natural resources and fracking in different parts of the state. What do you make of his changes?
The conversation around taxing fracking so you can cut income tax concerns me because it still doesn't allow there to be enough revenue to address those things that we were just kind of alluding to in terms of investment in infrastructure, investment in our future, and investment in our educational system, and investing in the right things at a pace that allows us to compete. And so, and as you know, the governor came out with his plans about education that were fairly broad, and we don't have all the specifics yet. But what I didn't hear in that conversation was that there would be a direct correlation between what it actually costs to educate kids and make sure that that system is adequate, and what we're going to spend. Putting more money in the system than we did last year is not the same thing as making sure that we're spending what it actually costs to educate kids, or that we're getting rid of the flaws that were in the previous formula in terms of phantom revenue that makes folks have to go back to the ballot to pass property tax levies. And so if you know those things are out there, and if you know they're not just important to educating children, but they're also important to our economic well-being going forward, then I'm a little concerned about the notion that I want to raise a tax here to cut a tax there, but I'm still not addressing sort of these global problems that we have in the state.
I guess in terms of the severance tax, maybe even Governor Kasich's blueprint on education, there's almost a willingness for him to kind of buck his party. He wants to, I guess, reduce income taxes, but it's through a tax increase on another industry. I don't think Republicans are really enamored with that idea. When you have the education blueprint, it's, like you said, it's very broad and lacks details at the moment, but it kind of speaks to a need to give more funding to more deserving districts in the sense that they don't have the resources to do the basic things in education. How does he reconcile that sort of I don't want you to get too far into Republican politics, but reconcile that dissonance with maybe some Democratic principles, but on Republican policy?
Well, you'd probably have to ask him. I couldn't really answer that completely, but I agree with you. The notion of raising a tax on fracking, I think, is a dilemma for ultra-conservatives who don't want to raise any tax on anything ever again, ever in life, for any reason. So I'm not really sure how they square that. And I won't say this just about Governor Kasich. I think a number of Republicans and Democrats want the same end goal. I think certain decisions are colored by our ideological orientations, and how we believe we can get to those goals differ, and they're shaped by what we've believed for a very long time. And I think on some level he really wants to do that, but there are certain things that he doesn't believe in that I think are, and his party don't believe in, that I think are obstacles to doing that. But there are certain guiding principles. The Supreme Court gave us some very clear direction back in '97 about what we should be focused on and what we shouldn't be focused on. They wanted us to figure out that there needs to be a correlation between what we spend and what it costs to educate kids, and that the cost of that shouldn't be a determining factor in our decision making. That if that's what it costs, then that's what we should spend. We should not be looking at it and say, well, that's just flat out more than we want to spend, so we're not going to do it. That was a very clear directive from the Supreme Court, that we needed to get away from an over-reliance on property tax. They didn't say we couldn't use property tax in any way. They just said we had to get away from over-relying on property tax. That over-reliance inherently means that where you live is going to be a much bigger factor in the quality of education that you get, and they were simply saying that that should not be the case. And that's not what the Constitution indicated, and I don't know if a lot of people realize the Constitution didn't say that you pay for public education with your property tax. That was a legislative decision for that to be the methodology. There's nothing in the Constitution that says you do it with property tax. The Constitution says that you will provide a thorough and efficient system of public education. However we get to that, and whatever set of taxes that we use to do that, we just need to get there.
And we can stay on one more question on education.
Sure.
You brought up phantom revenue. Could you explain that a little more, phantom revenue?
I've tried to explain that in a number of settings, and it always makes people's eyes glaze over, including mine. So the simplest way to say it is because there was a formula. The last session they really didn't use a formula. They just added money to whatever the previous formula was, or worked off the previous formula. But in that previous formula, the value of your property was used in the formula to determine how much money you would provide locally and how much money the state would provide. The lower wealth you were, the more money you got from the state. The higher wealth, the less money you got. But because of an amendment to the state constitution, that money does not keep pace with inflation unless you pass a property tax levy. So the basic form of funding public education just doesn't keep pace with inflation unless you pass a tax levy every year. And most communities don't do that. And now we've gotten to a point where a lot of communities don't pass them at all, and haven't passed one in quite some time. And so it creates more instability in terms of which districts have the funding to do what they're asked to do and which ones don't, and it leads to cuts in teachers and kids having to pay $500 a year to play football and all those things that we didn't have to do when I was growing up.
Last topic, employment. And I think jobs is still pretty much the first priority for a lot of people. What do we do about employment in the state, or specific to the district?
I think there are a number of things we can do. Education is a fundamental factor in that. Years ago I went to a conference in Seattle and I heard Bill Gates say it's not the taxes that make my decisions. It is an educated workforce, and where I locate has to look like someplace those folks want to live. And so it's an investment. And for us as legislators, as policymakers, it's important to understand that there's a distinction, just like in your personal finances, there's a distinction between consumer debt and investment debt. And we need to make sure that we are at least investing in the things that are going to make us competitive and productive. And those are education, higher education, it's infrastructure. Most companies in their siting decisions, taxation is 3, 4, 5th on their list. They want the educated workforce, they want an infrastructure, they want cheap, uninterruptible power. So those are things that are more critical. Finding out how we keep the innovations that occur here in Ohio, the resulting company that comes from that, make sure that it grows here in Ohio instead of relocating to another state for some other reason. This isn't necessarily a governmental function, but it is something we should spend some time trying to figure out, which is states like California have a much more liberal attitude about investing and I forget what you call them now, but but we need to make sure, our venture capitalists, where you can make a mistake in California and you're not automatically penalized or banned forever from people wanting to invest in you if you can show that you've learned something from it. And in the Midwest in general, that sort of mindset, it's improving, but it's still not quite there. And so whatever it is that we can do to sort of enhance that, to make sure that even if you've made a mistake but you've learned something from it, that capital is still available for that innovation to grow and seed a company or a future Fortune 500 company right here in Ohio. We need to make sure that we're doing those things.
And when you talk about innovation or the industries that leave the area or leave the state, what are some of those leading industries or areas where we could use more innovation to maybe create jobs, create new industries?
We've lost a fair amount of manufacturing, and so that's been a big issue, but we've not necessarily always lost those to other states. Quite frankly, we've lost those to other countries, and this isn't necessarily something we can address as a state, but federal tax policy in some cases, in far too many cases, has incentivized those companies going abroad, and our trade policy has not been negotiated in a way that's competitive with some of the rules or laws in some of those foreign countries are. They're not apples to apples. And I think the federal government has to be more aggressive about holding our trading partners to the same standard that we're being held to, and certainly stop incentivizing through our tax policy the shipping of our jobs abroad.
Thank you for your time, Representative Strayhorn. We appreciate you being here and hope you come back for more questions.
Well, thank you, Marcus. I appreciate it any time.
Hey yo, it's like
Come on. Put up. What? It's P-Rock, y'all.
Welcome back to Realpolitik and our Meet a Representative segment. Today we're with Ohio Representative Roland Winburn. Thank you for joining us, Representative Winburn, and welcome to the show. I'd like you to start by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for having me today to talk a little bit about what's happening at the state government and also myself. I'm State Representative Roland Winburn. I represent the 43rd House District. It's a newly drawn district comprising of the entirety of Preble County and western Montgomery County. In the western Montgomery County area, it's Brookville, Clayton, all of Harrison Township, and all of Trotwood. Then all of the cities and townships and villages in Preble County. This is my third term as a state representative. Before I served in the House in the 128th and 129th General Assembly. Currently, the committees that I currently represent or serve on are the Judicial, the Agricultural and Natural Resources, also the Ways and Means Committee, and I'm ranking member for the Manufacturing and Workforce Development Committees.
What are your legislative goals for this term of the General Assembly?
Well, this year I really have to wait pretty much until the State of the State address from the governor, which will be in the next couple of weeks in Lima, Ohio. And some of the things that we hear about this year, and I think yesterday in the newspaper, there was a article about his education reform plans and school formula plan. So I haven't had a chance to look at that yet, but that's one of the things I think we'll be discussing very much this year, as well as his ideas about how he's going to deal with the Ohio Jobs, the Turnpike, the Liquor Control Company, the board, and also related to the severance tax with oil and gas up in the northeastern Ohio, and trying to look at the severance taxes that will be addressed there. So it's going to be a lot of tax reform issues, I'm sure. We may have to approach again the redistricting situation, and also the constitutional commissions that we drew up last year. So we were looking at some of those efforts this year. Being a member of the Democratic Caucus, we also have and want to continue our compact with the middle class that we had in the last General Assembly to deal with jobs primarily. Getting people back to work, being employed and so forth. We also are looking at the Medicaid and Medicare issues this year with how we're going to address those things in the healthcare area. I think another area that is going to be important too is, particularly because I'm involved with the Ohio Black Legislative Caucus, is to deal with bills and legislation that's going to impact our African American community. Those things primarily is going to be looking at with health and other kind of community quality of life type of issues. So on February the 13th, we're going to roll out those agenda items from the Ohio Black Legislative Caucus, and in our Democratic Caucus, we'll be having a press release here within the next couple of weeks to address our agenda for that.
Can you give us an overview of your committee assignments?
I sit on the Ways and Means Committee. When I first started in my first term in the 128th General Assembly, I was vice chair of that committee. So now this is my third term that I've sat on the Ways and Means Committee. This year they have two new committees. One is the Judiciary. In the past General Assembly, I was ranking member for the Criminal Justice Committee. So they're rolling that committee into and naming it the Judicial Committee, and I'll be a member of that committee. I am also on the Agricultural and Natural Resources Committee. There we're going to address a lot of issues that deal with rural communities, rural type issues, soil and water kinds of issues, farming issues, crop issues, those kind of things as we move forward. I think one of the things that's going to be important in that particular committee this year is how we're going to address crops and production in light of the drought last year, and they're predicting a drought this coming year. So as we look at some of the things that happened in New Jersey with the storm there, we might want to relate what might happen in our areas where we rely on a lot of water to grow our crops. So that's going to be important. I'm also a ranking member for the other newly drawn committee, which is the committee that deals with manufacturing and workforce development. And I'm ranking member for that particular committee, so we'll be looking forward as some of the headlines this week, I think it was, is manufacturing is starting to come back here in Ohio. We've always had the slant that we wanted to keep Ohioans here. We wanted people who are born here, who are educated here, to come back here and stay here and work here and in the state of Ohio. So as manufacturers coming back, albeit it's going to be coming back at a different way though, because of the new technologies. And so we're looking at the different work skill sets of our people here in the area, as well as people who've gone off to school and got education, or skill sets that they have here to begin to work in some of those capacities here. So those would be the directions of these particular committees that I serve on.
Are there any policies, specific policies you would like to pursue in this next term?
I want to come back with a bill that was not heard last General Assembly, was the Buy Ohio bill. I'm looking forward to looking at some education legislation that will address the criminalization of children, to try to divert that. Will be two of my primary goals for legislation, as well as maybe cyber theft this year. The other area that I want to try to further develop is a caucus for sickle cell. That's been important. I've been working on that in the last couple of years, being on the advisory board for the state and also being involved here locally. So those are some of the legislation that I want to concentrate on this year. But I'm also trying to deal with energy and trying to address that in terms of how the buildings are dealing with different lighting right now to make some of these LED and to reduce the cost and increase the energy savings for businesses.
We said we'd give you a moment to speak directly to your constituents. What would you like to say to the voters in your district?
In the future, I'm planning for a number of town hall meetings, also conversations with Winburn in different areas. So I asked my constituents in these different areas to please come out. I want to hear their concerns as it pertains to perhaps any legislation that has been introduced, some of their concerns, particularly local government and educational kinds of concerns, as well as some of the other committees that I serve on. You know, this year is going to be a budget year. So everybody should be trying to help make sure that people are informed as we move forward with those discussions and deliberations there, but I would like to have their input on some of the items that's going to be before us in the budget this year.
Thank you for your time, Representative Winburn, and we really do hope to have you back.
Thank you very much, and I look forward for many of you out there in my district, the newly formed 43rd, to get in contact with me. In Columbus, my number is 1-614-466-2960, and you may contact my legislative aide, Portia Watkins. Thank you very much.
Mama, baby.
Welcome back to Realpolitik. I am currently sitting with Ohio State Senator Peggy Lehner, Chairwoman of the Senate Education Committee. Thank you for being with us, Senator
Thank you
Lehner.
for having me.
I want to start, introduce yourself a little bit. Maybe some of the viewers don't know you, they don't know what
Okay.
district you come from, so give us a little bit about that.
I represent the 6th Senate District here in Montgomery County, which is basically most of the suburban part of the county. I have a slither of East Dayton, but other than that, it's really the south, north, and east-west suburbs.
Okay. And how did you, I won't ask when, how did you get started in politics? When did this become your career?
My first elected office was Kettering City Council. I was elected in 1998, and I served there for about 10 years. And then I was elected to the Ohio House of Representatives. I served there for one term, and I was appointed, actually, to the Senate 2 years ago to complete John Husted's unexpired term when he was elected Secretary of State. And then I was just recently elected to a full 4-year term this past November.
Okay, congratulations.
Thank you.
I know, as I already mentioned, you're chairwoman of the Education Committee, but you also sit on a number of other committees, Medicaid and Health Care, Criminal Justice. Do you have any issues of priority?
Workforce development. I knew there was another one.
Oh,
Yeah,
workforce development.
Yeah.
Do you have any issues of priority for any of those committees, not just education, but?
Well, education obviously is my primary focus. It's something I've always been interested in, and I'm very honored to serve as the chairman. We have a tremendous challenge in this country, frankly, with education. One of the most frightening statistics to me is that 75% of our young people cannot get into the U.S. military. 50% of them because they cannot pass the basic reading and math test required to serve in the military. And that is a frightening statistic to me. So we need to do everything we can to make sure that our children have access to quality education and learning the skills they really need to be successful in the 21st century.
And so you talk about some people not being able to get into the military. Education seems to be a jobs issue, and it is a jobs issue, but from that prism, it's also a national security issue.
Yes.
We don't have the best.
Yes.
Well, we have the best and the brightest, but sometimes, you know, we shut people out who would like to serve our country in that capacity.
And you know, it's a first step for so many people to careers. They go in the Army, they get trained, they develop discipline, and then they go on very full lives. But it's not that I think everyone should go in the military by any means, but I just think it's indicative of the level of
we should
education
be able to pass
services.
those basic tests of reading and math skills, absolutely. As chairwoman of the Education Committee, I wanted to ask you, Governor Kasich recently released his school funding blueprint. I wanted to ask you your thoughts on that. Where do you think it really hits home some of the concerns about, you know, school funding in Ohio?
Yeah, I think it does. First off, you know, everyone makes this big deal about property taxes, and they were hoping that somehow this proposal would do away with property taxes. That's really unrealistic. Education costs a lot of money, and what the Supreme Court said is we couldn't rely on property taxes alone to fund our schools, that we had to have an equitable system. What Kasich has done with this budget proposal is actually create real equity for the first time in decades in Ohio's education funding system. And at the same time, while he created that equity, he has also put focus on those things that matter most, providing additional funding for items such as the third grade reading guarantee, et cetera, which goes to what we were just talking about a minute ago. We have made a commitment that no child is going to pass third grade without knowing how to read. And that's going to take some money. And I was really pleased to see him put like $180 million in his budget just to assure that happens.
Before we started the interview, you said a little bit about this blueprint actually addressing a problem called phantom revenue. And I won't ask you to touch too much on what phantom revenue is, but can you talk about how it actually addresses that problem?
Well, that's only one of the many issues that this touches, and most people don't understand phantom revenue. But basically, it's the gap that's created as you pass a levy and then you have inflation, and the amount of money being raised by the levy cannot rise with inflation. So you have this sort of false sense of money being out there. This does away with that by creating this 20 mil common level among all schools, and those communities that can't raise the 20 mils or can't raise $250,000 of property value through that per pupil through those 20 mils, the state then comes in and makes up the difference.
Let's a little bit about charter schools. If I understood it correctly, the plan also gives money to schools, charter schools that really put a lot of energy into innovation and efficiency.
Well, no, it's giving money to all schools who put money into innovation and efficiency.
Okay, well, can you talk
It's
a
a
little bit about
$300
that
million grant program that's available to any school, whether it's a charter school or a traditional public school. If they're going to come up with a program that's an innovative program that's going to drive the quality of education, as well as things that reduce the cost of education, but the quality being the key component to that.
Okay. And finally, the Supreme Court has set a, say, standard, for lack of a better word, that resources put into education actually meet the needs of the students. Do you think this blueprint, minus the details, actually addresses that issue? The resources we put into education are actually giving us the outcome we seek?
Well, I don't think they've been doing that. I think if they had, we wouldn't be struggling as much as we are. The Supreme Court requires that every child have an access to education, a quality education, and that it be equitably funded. So this program certainly does do that. It makes sure that districts that are lower wealth have the resources that they need to compete with the districts of higher wealth.
Okay. Thank you. I feel like we've touched on, you know, a few of the key issues regarding education. I really appreciate you coming by and answering these questions for us. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
When we come back, I'll have a few words on President Obama's second-term cabinet.
Well, it's a marvelous night for a moon dance.
I've been troubled by the recent demands that President Obama check gender boxes as he assembles his second-term cabinet. The president's first cabinet was dubbed the Team of Rivals. That's because he called on Hillary Clinton's service after a tough primary battle, appointing her as Secretary of State. He also tapped Joe Biden, another Democratic primary challenger, to be vice president. Not only did he invite them into his administration, but he gave them pretty loose reins to execute policy in the manner that they each saw fit. Hillary Clinton used her global prestige to strengthen diplomatic ties. Biden oversaw the president's large recovery and reinvestment plan. But that's only part of the story from President Obama's first administration. Much of his agenda was ambitious and somehow divisive. Anyone brought into the administration could anticipate sleepless nights, long days, and no thanks from the American public, especially Republicans. But if we want to focus on what President Obama did to add diversity to his cabinet and the lower levels of American government, we can. There's an exciting story to tell, and stories that I'm sure will continue into the second term, but only under President Obama's conditions. And like every story, this one needs a title. So it'll be called Quality Over Quantity, and it incorporates a lesson that we all should have learned in our early years. Let's take a look at the role women have played in President Obama's administration. First, naturally, is First Lady Michelle Obama. She is so clearly a source of strength for the president. She's passionate and poised, and is smart, supportive, and strong in her very own right. Her popularity has kept the president afloat in some very difficult times. The First Lady's personal initiatives also bolstered the perception of President Obama's agenda. Who can really say anything negative about fighting childhood obesity or supporting military families after a decade of war? Hillary Clinton deserves more respect as well. She performed in excellent fashion her duties at the State Department. Showing her characteristic grit and command of what's going on, she elevated America's standing in the world. And for the first time in many, many decades, that standing was not judged solely on the number of international conflicts we were ensnared in. But it had much more to do with the unique responses Secretary Clinton crafted for each global flare-up. Nancy Ann DePaul, a name seldom heard unless you're a political junkie, was President Obama's chief advisor on healthcare matters in the early part of his term. There she wielded great influence over the crafting and passage of President Obama's largest and most consequential piece of legislation to date. The Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is still looked at as the cornerstone of any legacy the president leaves behind. After passing the health care bill, it was left to Kathleen Sebelius to work on implementing the numerous changes in the law. Sebelius, the unlikely two-term Democratic governor of Kansas, had a future in national politics for herself. Instead, she chose to sacrifice her own overwhelming popularity in her home state to take on the toughest job in Washington, D.C. For decades, presidents of both parties tried to revolutionize health care. President Obama finally did it, and it was Secretary Sebelius' job to make the engine purr. Hilda Solis, a woman and a Latina, was appointed Secretary of Labor. In her capacity, Secretary Solis was a fierce advocate for all American workers, not just unionized jobs. She took joy in serving President Obama and supporting his policies. In fact, the work she did on behalf of his election often goes underestimated. Also, we cannot forget that cabinet positions are more managerial in nature than they are advisory. And despite running the sprawling Labor Department, she was a huge asset to President Obama's reelection. Speaking of the reelection, we should take a look at some of the important figures in the campaign. The person who comes to my mind first is Stephanie Cutter. Cutter can be described as nothing less than a warrior. A regular on cable news programs, she could be counted on to address fabrications and misrepresentations from the other campaign. And her expertise as a communications advisor for Senator Ted Kennedy and presidential candidate John Kerry was much used. There were so many others. Jen Palmieri, Jennifer O'Malley Dillon, Juliana Smoot, Rob Neighbors, Eric Holders, Susan Rice, who for other more unfortunate reasons is now a household name. All of these individuals added a great deal of diversity to the administration. But I tend to believe that none of them were chosen solely because of their skin color or gender. They had real expertise and important contributions to make. We should allow President Obama the freedom he deserves in assembling his second team of cabinet-level advisors. His first team seemed to quiet the many who doubted the infamous team of rivals. With John Kerry, Chuck Hagel, Jack Lew, John Brennan, and other familiar faces at his side, he might have the same luck in a second term. Thank you for watching Realpolitik. That wraps it up for us here. See you next time.